Victoria Aveyard graduated from USC, where she majored in screenwriting. The Red Queen is her debut young adult fantasy novel, the tale of 17-year-old Mare, a common girl whose magical power draws her into the dangerous intrigue of the king's palace. And Ryan Graudin was born in Charleston, South Carolina, with a severe case of wanderlust. When she's not traveling, she's busy photographing weddings, writing, and spending time with her husband and wolf dog. She is also the author of All That Glows series and The Walled City. In her novel, Wolf by Wolf, a survivor of the human experimentation at the hands of the Nazis enters a motorcycle race in which the winner is granted an audience with Adolf Hitler. She has one goal: win the race and kill Hitler.
Thank you. Thank you so much for introducing us. You did an excellent job. Okay, so Victoria and I are here, and we just found out that we're just going to talk. So we're just going to talk with each other, and you guys get to listen for a while.
Lucky you.
Yes, lucky you. So I just read Victoria Aveyard's Red Queen a few months ago. I was really kind of late on the draw because everyone's read it already, right? And I was just really, really astonished at Mare's story, and it's very X-Men-ish, but it's also fantasy, and it's really, really cool. So I'm just so excited to be able to talk with her today. Because she's pretty great.
Aw. Well, in the same vein, I am a huge, huge fan of Wolf by Wolf. I'm a total history nerd, so reading an alternative history of what would have happened if Germany and Japan, the Axis powers, had won World War II instead of the Allied powers was really, really cool. And just an amazing and I think really important way that she came at it, coming at it from a Holocaust survivor who's still trying to make it in this world that essentially everyone wants her killed in. And I think it's really not contemporary, but very important to today and the way that we see other people in the world. So Wolf by Wolf also combines sort of a fantasy element to it. So for me, I'm a big fantasy sci-fi nerd at the same time. So Wolf by Wolf is kind of like the nexus of everything I wanted in a book. So reading that, I was just like, this is the best. So yeah, thanks Ryan for gracing us with your presence.
So I know, a common question that gets asked a lot, authors, we always hear a lot of the same questions all the time, and it's obviously something that people want to know because they keep asking these things. But Victoria, my question for you is how, so your world, when I was reading it, I was expecting like a very high fantasy sort of world, but then there's like mentions of airplanes and like very modern things, and it kind of jerked me out a little bit, and then realizing, oh, this is actually kind of a dystopian, like speculative whatever in the future. But what kind of inspired you to create the world of the Red Queen?
I was particularly inspired, not necessarily in that exact time period, but by the feel of the power vacuum that followed the fall of the Roman Empire and the Dark Ages that subsequently followed. So I was really enamored with the idea of what would happen after the fall of the American Empire and what kind of power vacuum that would create in sort of a modern Dark Ages. So we have people who are, when you start really looking at it and divulging it, you have people who definitely, this city is Boston, this city is New York, this city is Philadelphia, but it's easy to sort of miss those things, and you know that there's a deeper history, but it's not too into the story yet. So for me, I'm also a map nerd. I'm just going to describe myself in various forms of nerd. It was a really cool puzzle for me to lay out, and my dad is a history teacher, and for him to be like, hey, I figured out what city that is and what island this is supposed to be, and like, why'd you do that to Cape Cod?
Why?
Yeah, so that was really cool, just sort of my particular taste, but the technology was really interesting because I love writing fantasy, but something that always stuck out to me about Lord of the Rings is there's a theory of, Middle Earth is Europe, and different parts of the map pertain to different parts of Europe and different parts of the Western Hemisphere, and I always loved that idea, and then I thought, I would love to do that too and write a fantasy that the further you go back in the history, you start to piece things together and realize, oh my God, this is us several thousand years in the future. So when the map finally came out, it was really cool to be able to be like, do you see now how these things fit together?
Do you see and I completely missed that when I was reading through it. But yeah, now that you say that, it totally makes sense.
I was really interested at how many people either immediately got it or didn't get it at all.
Yeah.
And it was really cool to see what things people latch on to. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's something really powerful about taking our modern day or even our history, and I think it's really cool that you did, you based it off of this vacuum of power in the fall of Rome. And, you know, unfortunately, history is always repeating itself, and I think that's one of the reasons it's so important to be writing these stories for teenagers that are based off of actual history and things that have happened. And that's one of the reasons that I kind of went into this alternate history with World War II. And I've always been really fascinated, just, you know, like you, with just history and what's happened in our world. And World War II was a very unique time in that you saw like the very absolute worst of humanity, but you also saw humanity at its best. Like you had people who were risking their lives for complete strangers. And it was a really strange time, and so I always really gravitated toward that. But I also wanted to know, like, what would have happened, like, if we'd lost the war, or if America hadn't even been in the war in the first place. And so that was it was a surprisingly dark place to go. Like with the research, you don't realize how impactful it is, especially if you're wading through it day after day after day, and the absolute worst side of humanity. And I've since like finished the series. Wolf by Wolf is a duology, so yes, there's another book. Yeah, and so I finished the revisions for the second book, and it's just this complete like 100-pound weight off of my shoulders that I didn't realize was there while I was writing it for those 2 years. So did you, when you were writing The Red Queen, like, did you find anything like really challenging about, because you do explore like the gladiator side of things.
Yeah, I was definitely inspired by the film Gladiator.
Yes, it's such a good film.
Love that movie. Yeah, the challenging part of writing is pretty much every aspect of writing.
Yeah.
As inspiring as that sounds. But it's totally worth it in the end. For me, quite recently, the most challenging part has been being a published author and still being a working author. No one really tells you that that's like having two jobs, because you know you are traveling, you are interacting with fans, especially through social media, which I totally love because it connects you with your readers so much easier. And but at the same time, you kind of have to shut it off when you really need to work. And for me, if you follow me on Twitter, you know I tweet way too much. I apologize.
Well, I mean, you're using two different sides of your brain.
Yes.
I think like writing is a very isolated. You're by yourself. It's you and the Word document just going at it. And then you have Twitter, and it introduces everyone else's
Right.
opinions and voices, and even traveling too. Like I talk to a lot of authors, and they're like, you know, even though you have free time in your hotel, it's really hard to turn off your brain and like get into that zone. So yeah, it is an interesting like balancing those two different things.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
Now, the reason I started writing fantasy, or really gravitate towards fantasy and sci-fi, at least in my writing, is because instead of doing all of this intense, heavy lifting research, I get to make it up myself. But for you, you had a mix of both, which is, you know, great, but at the same time sounds really, really difficult and really hard. So I'd love to know how much you researched and where you had to make your own leaps of faith and your own leaps in what you think would happen.
Yeah, so it's funny that you bring that up, because I was a huge reader growing up, and I always gravitated toward fantasy. So the Red Wall series by Brian Jakes was one of my favorite. This Abhorsen trilogy with Sabriel by Garth Nix. So I always envisioned myself as a fantasy writer, and for that very reason, like when I was a teenager, I went to an art school and was a creative writing major, and I always found research very boring. And even as a college student, like writing research papers, I would do like the barest minimal that I could, and it was the same thing with revising. I would never go back and revise anything. But I think as I've grown as a writer, I do, as I was saying, I always have been incredibly fascinated by research, and as my second book, The Walled City, when I started writing it, I tried to make it a fantasy, and it just didn't work for some reason, and it actually turned into a thriller. And that book was also based on a real place called the Walled City, and it had a lot of research, and I built it so that it was very parallel to the actual place, and it could be read as a historical fiction novel, or it could be read as like a speculative dystopian, so depending on what you know about the city when you go into reading this book. So I had that research under my belt when I started thinking about exploring an alternate World War II scenario. And I had a lot of previous life research with World War II because I was so fascinated with it growing up, read a lot of books, took a lot of classes in college on it, but at the same time, like, you can't just go in and write whatever you want. Even if it's alternate fiction, alternate history, you have to go. And so I basically read a lot. I read a lot of books. My Bible at the time is called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shearer, and it's a 1,500-page door stopper. And it basically chronicles that entire period of history from the birth of Adolf Hitler to the fall of the Third Reich. And it goes into all sorts of different things, but the chapters that were the most essential and important to me were actually the Hitler's vision of the new order, so what he thought the world would look like when he won the war. And it's really, really grim, and it's really, really depressing. And researching that, I can't help but be like, thank God that never happened. But so I spent a lot of time with those chapters. But then there's also little things that I base off of research that the regular reader might not really pick up on, but Hitler had so many crazy plans for Berlin when he won the war. He wanted to have a complete architectural rehaul of the city, and there's maps you can find online that he wanted to build was called the Volksschau, and he kind of based it off of the Vatican. But he's like, I want to make this dome 10 times bigger than the Vatican because my view, Berlin is now the world capital, and so there's things that I found through research that I was able to put into the world of Wolf by Wolf that were very speculative, but were actually based in history. So that was, while researching was really mentally hard, it was kind of cool to find out those things, and it's scary at the same time. But yeah,
that is just fascinating.
A lot of research.
My mind is blown. But it sounds like you found some really fantastic things. Another part of Wolf by Wolf that really struck me is how intensely real your characters are at the same time as being in this world that we know is not real. So I wondered how you took either pieces of yourself or people that you know to inject them into something we know did not happen and try to make it feel like it actually did.
Yeah, so, obviously I wanted to, so my main character, her name's Yael, and she is a survivor of the concentration camps. And this was a very, very touchy subject, and something I approached with great caution and wanted to approach with great respect, because I know that there are still people alive today who went through that and survived. And I was approaching it in a very non-traditional, speculative manner. And that was actually a very scary thing, and something that I wrestled with for a long time of is this something I can do, or is this something I'm even allowed to do? But I did a lot of research, watched a lot of documentaries, read a lot of memoirs, in order to just grasp what, someone who's gone through all of these things, basically a survivor's mentality, and how they would approach new relationships and new people. Every single person is different, and so everyone responds to things in their own way. But Yael's experience was, so I went and read all of these memoirs, but I also wanted to make her strong. One of my favorite television characters is Sydney Bristow from Alias, and I always wanted to, there's the stereotype of the strong female character, which we can talk about in a minute because that's part of the title of this conversation. But Sydney Bristow, she's a very strong, kick-butt female character. She speaks lots of languages. She fights really well, but she's also really vulnerable. And you get that side of her, with her relationship with her father, and her relationship with all of her coworkers. And I knew that I had to give Yael this very vulnerable human side, because otherwise she would become too much of an automaton or a machine. And so I think that's one of the reasons that so many people resonate with her, is because she does, she feels pain and she feels insecurities, and she doesn't know who she is. She experiences a really severe loss of identity because her face is literally stolen from her. She cannot remember what her original face looks like. So she basically has to go through and weave all of these memories together to figure out what makes a person who they are if you don't have your outer appearance. But I know your character, Mare, is also, she is a very strong-willed person, and she's just like plopped into this this world of royals and a world where she doesn't really belong, but I feel like she kind of makes her own way through that. So yeah, how do you feel about strong female characters?
I'm glad you asked, Ryan. Yeah, I know that I have a large problem with the whole stereotype of the strong female character. I know a lot of writers do, because a lot of people think strong female character means a female who can kick your butt, which is, just a very, very small part of a person. I think our definition of strong female character should be a complete female character. Doesn't mean they're always in the right, doesn't mean they're the protagonist, doesn't mean they're the strongest girl in the room. It means that they are a real person with thoughts and feelings and dreams and a personality. So for me, my favorite quote-unquote strong female characters are the complex ones who have sort of dueling moralities. I am a big fan of gray characters. Game of Thrones for me totally opened the whole world of, what it is to have real people in a book and how real people would act in a fantasy world. That was really fantastic to think. And then you go back and look at Lord of the Rings and you're like, these basic people. But yeah.
Why do you always take the high ground?
But for me, creating Mare, it was as much about making her, physically strong, because I like kick-butt movies. I like blockbusters and explosions, so I wanted to have a girl who could hang with that, but at the same time I wanted to have a girl who was a real person and had fears and had dreams and had wants and was going to make mistakes. My favorite characters are the ones who make mistakes and who are messy and who don't necessarily know who they are. I think a lot of people when writing YA or reading YA forget the people they're reading about are 15, 16, 17 years old, and they're not perfect. And you get people who say, oh, this girl got so swept up in that guy and made the wrong choices.
Like, I did
and
that
you're just
when I was
thinking,
16.
Were you a perfect 16-year-old with like a law degree? Is that what's going on there? But yeah, I think it's really important for us to portray real people. At the same time, you want to put on a good show, so find the happy medium as much as you can.
Yeah, so Victoria and I were actually both talking about this before, but we both find ourselves often on these panels that are the strong female character panel. And so you might, if you've heard me on a panel before, you've probably heard me talk about this. But when you say strong female character, you're automatically like discounting. You're saying she is the exception of the female gender. And I think that's a really, really harmful and poisonous thing to be putting into our young readers, because we want to be showing girls in a very real light. Like, people are people. And reading really cultivates empathy. There's a lot of psychological studies that show that readers who grew up reading Harry Potter are, generally they're more tolerant to minorities and immigrants. And I think that's just kind of an echo of the power of words and the power that stories have. And so I think that's where the issue of like girls' books and boys' books come in. And if you're saying boys cannot read books about girls, or, unless this girl is like a strong character or whatever.
Even
like
Hunger Games, some boys still won't read that book. And you're like,
yeah, like to say like I'm not going to read a book because it has a female main character. That's a really dangerous road to go down, because I think we need to be reading each other's stories. We need to be relating to characters who aren't like us. And so, yes, I love writing about strong women, but that's not the only thing I'm trying to write. And it's also like you want to show strength in different ways, because there's lots of ways to be strong. Yeah. Like you can go around electrocuting people, and that's perfectly fine. Yeah. But there's also emotional strength. There's
Sansa Stark is just as strong as Arya Stark, if not more so.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Fight anyone who believes otherwise.
And then you have intelligence, like Hermione. Literally everyone in the Harry Potter series would be dead if Hermione was not as amazingly smart as she was, right? And so it's not just about punching people in the face or like as much as we like watching those kinds of movies.
And of course there's a fantasy element on our part too, because we are women in a world that is kind of geared against us. So it would be, I think all of us have had a moment in our lives where we're like, I wish I could just electrocute this person in front of me.
Oh, I mean,
I wrote that character.
Literally every time I get catcalled, I tell my husband, I'm like, I wish I had like a shock collar, like the power to just, not hurt them, but like to just zap them a little bit and be like, no, that's not okay. Like, don't objectify me.
Jessica Jones came out yesterday on Netflix, and so there's a great wish fulfillment of being able to walk down the street and that I am the baddest person on this block and I can do whatever I want.
Yeah. Oh, to be Jessica.
I'm only one episode in. No spoilers.
I haven't watched it yet. I've just seen.
It's pretty good so far.
Yeah, I've heard really good things.
We are paid shills from Marvel.
Yes, I love Marvel. So another aspect about this conversation that I suppose we're supposed to talk about is the concept of like resistance and kind of going against the mold. I know that's a popular thing in young adult things these days, especially with, the final installment of the Hunger Games is coming out, and it's all about like, we are the revolution, like set fire to the man. So what, like, I know like that's very much a theme in the Red Queen, the Red Guard and all of these things. And I think it's really cool that you have people who actually like wear the headbands and carry the swords.
Well, we had to give them to them and make them wear them. So,
but that's still really cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I think because this is a post 9/11 America, and for me, I'm 25 years old, and I have lived in a wartime country for, God, what was
Most
it, 2003? 12 years of my life has been spent in a wartime America. I barely remember what it was like before. So that definitely comes out in the writing. I also think we particularly now have a feeling of helplessness in terms of how our government is run. You feel like you don't have a voice. You don't know how to change that, even though we supposedly live in the greatest democracy on earth. But it feels like the people who should be listening aren't. So our art represents that. One of the greatest lenses on a society is the art of that society. So if you want to know what things were like in ancient Greece, look at their plays and you will figure it out. If you want to know what things were like in the 60s, look at the movies that were coming out. Star Wars was a direct response to the malaise of Vietnam and how people wanted an escape, and then suddenly you were in a galaxy far, far away, and it was this big hit because people needed it. Sorry, that was my film school coming out for a little bit.
But that's fascinating. And actually, no, this was coming up today of how there's actually a huge upwelling of alternate history World War II stories that are coming into, like The Man in the High Castle just released on Amazon. And so I think it's really interesting that, there is this collective conscience that occurs when you have like these world events that are happening. And so the art is the response to that. That's
and
cool.
There's a definite parallel with what's going on in the world today. We have resistances that are definitely bad, and there are resistances that you don't quite know what's going on there, and we get different reports on them based on what the news is telling us and what network you're watching. So it's really sort of our own way of trying to figure out what's going on, and if you put it in a fantasy setting, it's maybe a little bit of an easier pill to swallow, but also just something for us to work through and understand, how the world around us is changing and how to get what's going on, because this is really difficult stuff.
I think having read The Red Queen, you do that ambivalency really well, because at first you're like, yeah, the revolution, and then there's things that happen, and then you're like, wait a minute, like, war. It's easy to be like, let's go bomb all of the bad guys, but then you take a step back and you look at it as it'd be like, oh, there are people too, and there's no black and white here. A lot of it is very gray, and I think fantasy is a very effective way to examine that without immediately shunning your reader or having someone be like, oh no, this is wrong, or
And clearly we're not politicians or military strategists.
No, don't count on me to strategic
but this is just
military.
Our own way of sort of working through that.
Yeah.
So do you guys have any questions for us on either anything we talked about or anything in general? You guys ready for Star Wars?
Yeah. All right, we got a question over here.
I definitely took a lot from X-Men. In my book, Red Queen, there's two different kinds of people. There's normal red-blooded humans who have nothing and are kind of oppressed by the elite silver-blooded humans who have superpowers. So there are people who can like control and manipulate fire or earth or water, have super strength, super speed. There's people who can read your minds, that kind of thing.
That's
So
scary.
yeah, it was cool. So a lot of that came from just like looking at the Wikipedia of superpowers, and a few of them were really cool. And I was like, no, I'm going to hold off on those ones until the second book. So those that'll be fun to sort of see who the new people are popping up. But for the most part, it was just a lot of their personalities suited the powers that they had. So obviously, you know, the more fiery characters could control fire.
Fiery.
Yeah. And the main character, Mare, is very angry and sort of has all this energy, and she doesn't know where to put it, and is sort of a storm in a person. So obviously she can control and create lightning. So that was really fun to sort of fit a person to an element.
What I really admired with the whole power thing in the Red Queen was how you executed the battles that happened between these people. Because I'm like, well, obviously, like the water's gonna kill the fire, like. But
There's a lot of Pokemon that went into this.
Yes, yeah. I was like, clearly, like Charizard. And
I broke both my arms.
Squirtle.
Over Pokemon cards, by the way.
Yeah, I collected them too. You
Yeah.
had like the binder with the little sleeves.
Oh, yeah, the
yeah. And then
sleeves.
you had like 5 of one card, and you're trying. Yeah.
Those energy cards
man.
were full.
So yeah, I thought it was really cool how like you went about that, and I was like, I don't envy her that job at all. Just like trying to figure out. But
Well, I would love to know what inspired you to give your main character not a sort of a superpower, an ability, because obviously you think, you know, okay, alternate World War II was won by the Axis. That's a story in itself. But you took it one
but
step
let's throw
further.
in something.
No,
Yeah.
I'd love to know where that came from.
Yeah, so all of my books have start off with like I call it my idea seed. So it's like either it's like a picture that pops into my head, or it's for Wolf by Wolf, it was the very first sentence of the book, which is, once upon a different time, there was a girl who lived in a kingdom of death. Wolves held up her arm, a whole pack of them, made of tattoo ink and pain, memory and loss, and it was the only thing about her that ever stayed the same. And so,
Don't you want to read that book now? Yeah.
So Yael's power, or her ability, was always a part of the narrative. And it seemed like a very strange thing to introduce. So her ability is basically that she can skin shift, which means she can change her appearance to look like any other female at will. And so because of these experiments that happened to her when she was 6 years old, she has literally forgotten her first face. So she doesn't know what she looked like, but she has spent her entire life impersonating the perfect Aryan face, or like all of these identities, and passing basically in this society. And then she uses this gift, or this ability to pose as one of the previous racers. So Wolf by Wolf is following her as she's going on this cross-continental motorcycle race, and she's posing as a girl named Adele Wolf, and she encounters Adele's twin brother Felix, and also Adele's former love interest named Luca. And so these two boys know Adele really well, and Yael has no idea. And so the book is about her like trying to be someone that she isn't. Like, she looks perfectly like Adele. She has all of like the accent and the gait and everything. She studied this girl for a year trying to pass as her, and is passing, but also realizes she can never be Adele. So the book was very much turned out to be about identity, especially in this World War II. Most of Hitler's policies were based on racism and anti-Semitism. And so introducing this idea that appearance is fluid really helped me address the question, what makes a person a person? It's not what we look like, right? It's not who we are on the outside, it's who we are on the inside. And so by introducing this speculative element, I was able to explore these themes in a way that I couldn't have if I hadn't. And so, but yeah, I think the base inspiration was at one point X-Men too, as well. Like her powers are very much like Mystique. Obviously, there's some differences there, but yeah, to be able to explore the stories in a way, in a new and unique way, was definitely my goal in that.
It's fantastic, yeah. The way that you sort of had her identity was essentially a metaphor for the way that an entire identity of an entire people was eradicated, and how she's trying to reclaim that was really, really powerful. And at the same time, it's you know, at the end of the day, really entertaining book. The third act, I honestly like shooed people out of the room when they would come talk to me. I'm like, no, the race is almost over. I need to know who won. Get away from me. So it has a lot to say, but it's also, you know, a really great ride.
Thanks.
Yeah. More questions?
Yes, there's a question over here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, so The Walled City was my other novel with Little Brown that came out last year, and it also deals with really hard topics. One of the main characters, Maggie, she's trapped inside of a brothel, so it deals a lot with sex trafficking and all of the baggage that comes with that. And so you're right, I'm kind of crazy for like tackling these really hard,
talented, the word is talented.
these really hard ideas, and you know, it wasn't something that I went into the book and I was like, I'm going to write about the Holocaust or I'm going to write about human trafficking. It was just something that kind of rose or very organically as I approached these stories. And just through traveling and experiences, like my sister-in-law works in El Alto, Bolivia, and she actually works with a nonprofit in the red light district, and so she is interacting with these women who work on the streets every day, like giving them health care and child care and micro businesses, and so I, you know, have had some very peripheral experience with these issues. But as for which book was harder to write, I think each one has its own unique challenges. You know, there was also The Walled City is set inside of a culture. It's, you know, based on Chinese culture, which I was not familiar with when I started writing it, and quickly did a lot of research and had a lot of reads. But yeah, I think for every novel, I kind of want to like one-up myself. And, you know, I get bored very easily. And so I always want something that's going to challenge me. And so, you know, when I went into Wolf by Wolf, I was like, alternate history. I haven't tried a historical novel yet, so I'm gonna do this. And so, you know, my next idea is I'm hoping will be a sci-fi, which I haven't tried yet. And so I'm always trying to find out, like, the next level up for me. And yeah, they were both very emotionally hard to write because they dealt with very heavy but true emotional issues, and I think it's very important for teenagers to be learning about these things, which is why I write them in the end and put myself through that. Yeah.
How does sending books like to booktubers and book blogs, how does it like help you? Like, what does it do?
Because we're coming from traditional publishing houses, is usually not us personally, but I know our publicity and marketing teams totally use you guys, especially for debuts. Because I know for me, the word of mouth and the buzz for Red Queen only started because of bloggers and YouTubers and epic reads and online communities like that. So, I mean, without you guys, so many books would never get off the ground. So it's really fantastic that you guys exist. And I know a lot of book bloggers and YouTubers are, you know, high school kids who just do this because they love books and they're not being paid or anything like that, and they just want to help out and want to be a part of the community. It's really cool.
Yeah, and like honestly, it's all about word of mouth. Like it doesn't really matter how much, I mean, it does to some extent matter how much your like publisher is behind you, but you know, the publisher can pour like hundreds of thousands of dollars into marketing and a book will just fall flat, or there will be a book that, you know, like doesn't have that much marketing behind it, but it really resonates with people, and they're like, read this book, I love it, it's so amazing, and then it just kind of explodes from there. So it really is, at the end of the day, it's about you bloggers and you know, the YouTubers, and it's about the reader, and that's why we do what we do.
Especially in YA. The biggest hits in YA, you know, Harry Potter, Twilight, Hunger Games.
Harry Potter is like the perfect example.
They are all word of mouth books. No one expected those to be gigantic, and then suddenly they were complete game changers because people read them and told other people about them. You can't buy what happened to those books. They were also just, you know, good.
Yeah, so which is why people were talking about them. So thank you for doing what you do. We really appreciate it.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Like parts that you don't like about the world, like Queen Elena being like deep bigotry, like the body
Yeah, sure. I think especially because my book is first person point of view, it's really, really, really difficult to write in that format and not have pieces of you be in it. It's almost impossible. Anyone who can write first person a character who is not them at all, like, hats off to you, because I have not figured out how to do it yet. But I think every character, even the quote-unquote evil antagonist characters, have pieces of me in them, and pieces of my personality or pieces of things that I see in everyday life that I want to examine, just because I don't have a connection to them if there's nothing in there that I see calling to me. Especially, at least when I approach my villains, my big, I really love villains who have a reason for what they do. There's this great quote, you know, the best villain thinks they're the hero of their own story. So I really love trying to twist and play with people who think they're doing things for not necessarily the greater good, but their own greater good. And, you know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Always really cool to see. Yeah.
I'm not familiar with any of this.
Totally fine.
Fire away.
The title of this program today is Girl Power.
Mm-hmm.
What I would like you to do, and you kind of did, was tell me 3 things about each of the main women in your stories that they did that you feel was girl power.
Okay. Number one, yes.
You're like, what is
You're
this girl
welcome.
power stuff?
I like women who make their own decisions, who either do things because it's what they want to do or it's what they feel is right. I also like women who make bad decisions. I think that's one of the more stronger ways to characterize a person, is to let someone make their own mistakes. I feel like authors, not necessarily good authors, but some authors feel the need to make perfect characters and feel the need to have people who don't make mistakes, and I think that's just not true.
But that makes boring stories.
And it does. It makes for a boring story. Another thing in my book, for those of you who haven't read it, I really don't want to spoil things too much, but you know, YA always has sort of a love story angle to it, and at least in this one, there's a point at the end where the girl says, you know, I don't choose you and I don't choose you, I choose me. And that was one of my favorite parts to write, to have a girl say, you know, no, this is about me, and have her be a little selfish. I like women who are selfish too, because in at least the worlds that we write, if someone else isn't going to look out for them, they have to look out for themselves. And then I guess the third thing is they love very, very deeply. Almost everything in my book, whether good or bad, is done out of love. And I think that people without love are some of the weakest and scariest people on Earth.
Yeah.
Lord Voldemort, for example.
Yes. He's terrifying.
Cannot feel love because he was conceived under the effects of a love potion. Those of you, yeah, sorry. Yeah, well, I hope we all did.
I'm a feisty woman and I'm a poet, and that's the main piece that I have written. That's going to be my signature.
Oh,
Feisty women.
yeah, there you go.
Little, I laminated
Oh,
Nice.
whatever I
Yeah, and I think, you know, you're really onto something about, like, creating likable women. That's not what we're here to do. Like, women have been expected to be likable for
Yes,
whatever
and to
the past
apologize.
how many
and to take up no space.
billions of years. Yeah. And it's funny because, like, looking back at, like, you know, certain things, like, yeah, when you're on the subway, you, like, automatically, like, hunch up, and if a guy sits next to you, you, like, make the space. And it's things that it's all about, like, body language and expectations that society has put on you for so long. And I'm just now, like, you know, at 28 years old, starting to realize, oh, like, these are things that have been, like, completely ingrained in me, even though mentally I'm like, I don't want to be necessarily, like, the agreeable, like, don't make waves, you know, well-behaved women rarely make history, that bumper sticker. Yeah, you see it all the time. But yeah, in my books, I think it's not so much, like, about the girls necessarily being the exception, although a lot of times they are, but I think of being, like, they are capable of operating in a world, a man-centric world. So, like, in Nazi Germany, a lot of Hitler's other policies were he believed that women were suited only for the kitchen and making babies, basically. And so they actually had things called the Lebensborn, and it was basically German women were expected to go to these camps, even if they weren't married, if they had the right pedigree. They were expected to go to these camps, and it's kind of like in Mad Max, where you see like all of the women just like popping out these babies. It's basically that. So he wanted to populate his Lebensraum, which was like the promised land, which was why he was attacking Russia. So women were very much second-class citizens, commodities in Nazi Germany, and so I have a lot of women characters who are going against that grain and saying, like Adele Wolf, the girl who Yael basically steals her identity, she, in the year before, she disguised herself as her twin brother to enter this motorcycle race because women weren't allowed to race. So she's basically like, oh, screw this. And so she enters the race and wins, and then reveals herself as a woman. And then Hitler, at that point, is basically like, okay, well, you can have it, which there are also historical precedents for that. But yeah, as women who can operate in the world of men, they have to work twice or thrice as hard to prove themselves. Yeah, still, and that's still the case today, unfortunately. But yeah, I think it's like women who really don't care what society thinks and just do it anyway.
Yeah, I wrote a fantasy, and one of the really big pieces of fantasy in my book, at least, is that women are equal to men in this book.
Whoa!
In terms of even military structure, there are female colonels and generals and women in combat, and everyone's sort of on the same playing field. The queen is just as important as the king situation. So it's really sad that, you have to write a fantasy novel to make that work.
Yeah, that's actually, I've been binge watching The 100. I don't know how many of you guys have done that.
And
but
Battlestar Galactica too does
yeah,
it
Battlestar
very
Galactica.
well.
But like I was watching it, I was like, all of these generals are female. And like to be like, okay, I kind of expected like one, maybe two, but then like to have 4 really strong female leaders, like that's, to even now I'm like, this kind of blows my mind. But it's really cool that that the show has gone there and been like, yeah, this is a future that we can envision.
All right.
Yes.
What kind of style of writing do you guys prefer? Since like first person, second person, or third person?
All of them.
Yeah, it depends. It depends on the story. For Red Queen, first person definitely suits because it's so focused on one person and her inner journey as well as her outer journey. But I have other projects that I am chipping away at that are much better in third person, either because they're ensemble pieces that change point of view, or just because it's a world that needs to be described in third person. Something I'm always a slave to is the world building. That's always my number one thing with stories. And then on the other side of my career, there's the screenwriting bit, which doesn't have third or first person. It's a very different format, and it actually makes for things quite easier because you don't have to choose. You just, tell the visual story. But yeah, all of them work for me.
Yeah, so of the 4 books that I've written, I have these fairy books that are out with Harper Teen. It's very first person, and it sticks with this one character. The Walled City is also a first person point of view, but it switches between 3 characters, and so you get this really braided narrative. And I knew that, like, especially with Mei Yi, the girl who's being trafficked, I wanted to have that first person point of view to really cultivate empathy. But with Wolf by Wolf, when I sat down to write it, I specifically chose third person point of view because of Yael's identity crisis. She has no idea really who she is, and she's still struggling to find that, and that's what the story is about. And so it doesn't really make sense for me to put it in first person, like, I wanted to create that sense of detachment that she also felt, and it kind of came in handy because in the sequel the world expands a lot, and that would have been much harder for me to do in first person. But yeah, it is basically just depends on the project and what you envision it being. Oh, one more question. Yes.
When you guys are doing the world building at the top, do you guys kind of have an outline that you guys go by, just kind of have an idea and then go from there?
Weirdly for me, Red Queen was the first book that I did a very little amount of world building for before I started. I have pages and pages and pages of terrible, terrible world building for like Lord of the Rings knockoff books. And I think part of the reason why this is the first book I finished is because I didn't burn myself out world building nonsense things. Like I didn't need to draw a map with trade routes on it, which I really love to do, but I didn't do it this time around. I sort of let parts of the world come organically. In terms of outline, I make myself outline story-wise, so, like a 5 to 7 page paper on what the story is going to be, and it's just the bones, and then you find the flesh and the skin while you're writing. But world building wise, this kind of came together as I was going along. I knew the basic structure. One really amazing piece of advice I got from my professors in college is, especially as it pertains to fantasy and sci-fi, is you can get the audience or the reader to believe one unbelievable thing, and everything else must build off of that. So for me, this was several thousand years in the future. Some people have evolved to have superpowers, and everything else has to make sense in terms of that piece. So I tried to do that as best as I could, and that really informed, where I could go in the parameters of the world and the story.
Yeah, for me, setting, I love setting, and it's my goal as a writer to treat setting as a character. And so for like the Kowloon Walled City, I did, I based it off of a real place, and so I did so much research before I even put the pen to page. And a lot of that research actually helped me as I was writing, it helped me flesh it out, to be like, oh, everyone has bars on their veranda windows to keep the thieves out, and then the bars become a sort of like symbol for one of the characters, because while it's meant to keep thieves out, he also feels caged in by these things. And so yeah, I do research, and it helps when with historical fiction and stuff like that, it helps to have things that you can research. Like with purely fantasy worlds, when you're making everything up, I find that almost harder, because
I find doing the research harder. So.
Yeah, because the research is really what helps me. It helps me generate ideas, and it, it's taking real themes and real things from our world and then building them into like something that's separate but also still concrete and relatable. I find pretty fascinating to do.
And when we say research, we don't just mean, go to the library and crack open a book. You're doing research right now, just like walking down the street.
Yeah.
Research for writing, because the best research is just, living your own life and finding your own path and figuring out how to write that organically and truthfully.
Traveling is a huge inspiration for me.
Yeah.
And actually, when my husband found out I was going to work on Wolf by Wolf and do this cross-continental motorcycle race, he surprised me. He took me on a date to a dirt biking. So we live in South Carolina, so we went to like the middle of the state, and it's like acres and acres of these like forests and like dirt biking paths. And he's like, I'd never operated a motorbike before. And he's like, let's go through the woods. And so, we did that. And then I have friends who, they collect World War II rifles, and they're very experts on that. And so they took me to the firing range, and I learned how to shoot the guns that my main character would do. So yeah, research is often, it's not just, it is a lot of reading, but it's also just like tactical experience. And
definitely been to the range for research.
Yes.
Right,
Thank you.
Victoria and I will be available to sign books just outside in the author signing room. So I just ask that you let them leave before so they can set up.
Please. Don't everyone run at once.
Oh, well, that went more smoothly.
Yeah, that was really could have been bad. I'm gonna